from my perspective, is to always question assumptions and make sure that you understand everything and then retest again right the day before, kind of stuff. With time, so that's the scientist me. That's the me who works in isolation and just chugs along. But with time, I've noticed that it's the team that makes the whole thing. It's make sure that you know what your colleagues know, that they know what you know, that you talk to each other, and that you care about what they care. It's a mind shift. When you depend on yourself, you have a measure of control, and obviously I'm a control freak. When you depend on others, you have to cede control and you have to give up your part so that everybody can be successful. So it's a harder part.
Hello, and welcome to Pharma Sessions, a place for pharmaceutical leaders to come and learn from each other. I'm your host, Jonathan Kaskey. Technology and market trends are bringing change at an ever-accelerating rate, and no person, team, or company can afford to be left behind. Here, we dive into the strategies and tactics that our guests use to tackle these challenges and create new opportunities, and how you can do the same in your own organization. On today's episode of Pharma Sessions, I'm excited to welcome Ana Bozas, a medical affairs and scientific communications leader with deep experience across rare diseases and biopharma. Ana currently serves as Director of Clinical Science at Vera Therapeutics, supporting clinical strategy in kidney disease as the organization prepares for pivotal regulatory moment. Previously, Ana led scientific publications and medcoms at Ipsen, with other roles at Vera Therapeutics, Ionis, Sanofi, and Acabia, giving her a unique perspective across startups and established organizations during high-stakes launch periods. Ana, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Excellent. All right. So before we get into it, I always like to do a quick warm up, quick get to know each other. Right. So we're in the end of January now, but was there any music or albums that you were listening to on repeat last year? What did you find yourself playing when you were in the mood for that type of thing?
That's a good question. I will say, this is one of those questions that seems easy to warm up, but it isn't, because I'm a working mom with teenagers, so I have no hobbies, no life. I used to have a personality and like music, mostly Pink Floyd, but lately I'm just putting electronic music for work. So it's like coding music on YouTube. I'm not coding, but it's essentially, be productive all your day.
So I played from Pink Floyd the song, I think it was Pigs or something, from the Animals album for my 12-year-old daughter, and she thought it was the most boring song that she had ever heard. She's like, "This thing is 7-8 minutes long. What are you doing?"
It is 7-8 minutes long. I don't know with the current attention span. I tried the karaoke night with my girls, and they told me I'm tone deaf, and that my music choices, which happen to be the 80s, were completely too old and unfashionable. So yeah.
No, you got to stand your ground on that one. They're the ones that need to come around. So
It's fine. I love them anyway. How about that?
all right. So let's start a bit with your journey. So you grew up in Romania, right? Moved to North America through Canada, Utah for your PhD, eventually landed in Boston. How do you think that unconventional path shaped who you are today?
Okay, I don't know. For me, it seems very conventional. I will say that you don't know what normal is, because normal is normal to you, kind of thing. So I will say that in biotech and pharma, very few people have one set path. Most of my colleagues do weird circumventions and go in loops. And typically the degrees that I see most around me, obviously being in medical, is MD, PhD, and PharmD. And very few of us think that we'd be working for pharma in the future. Nobody says when you're 7 years old, what are you going to do? And you're going to say, I'm going to work for a big corporation making medications, okay? Even if you do want to cure all the world ills or whatever, okay? The paths in pharma and biotech are very rarely straightforward. I think they used to be straightforward 25 years ago, or maybe, my parents' generation, but certainly not this generation, whatever's coming after us.
That's interesting, right? Because it kind of brings like a diversity of thought, we'll call it, as people have their own experiences and their own interests before they get into pharma. And you've described yourself not necessarily as an innovator, but as a collage artist. So what do you mean by that? And how does that mindset show up in how you approach, medcoms, launch strategy, et cetera?
So that's a good characterization. I essentially the reason I gave myself that label is because we in biotech, at least, we say all the time, and pharma for that matter, we say all the time we're innovators. And yes, in a way, we are innovating because we're bringing medicines that didn't exist before to life, and and all of that. But I think it's less about innovation and more about learning what works for you and applying that in a way that is successful. So that's why I'm saying, yeah, it's a collage artist. I try to take the things that I admire best about the various things I encounter in my work life and my personal life, to be honest. Okay, I don't keep it all that separate, and try to to bring that collage of best practices and great ideas together to sort of shape the current vision. And it's always a different vision. We kind of all aim for the same thing. We're always all patient centric. We always want to serve the patients and save the world, but we do it differently at different organizations. So yeah.
So I think I understand what you're saying, but do you have an example of what that actually looks like?
I will say that, I've been for the most of my career in publications and scientific communications, right? And publications, in a way, it's a very templated thing. So, you have research, you have to put it in a paper, you submit it to a journal, which has been there for 100 years. So they have a way of doing things, and then it goes out and people read it. So it's a very standard thing. And, the printing press has been around for, 600 years. And before that, the quill and whatever. So it's pretty standard in some ways. But how you express your ideas, what kind of idea you do, how you disseminate in this technology world, what makes your specific drug special or that particular disease that needs attention. All of these are things that vary quite a lot. So that's the stuff that changes from company to company. It may be the same, thing that I have to do, but I do it relatively differently depending of where I am and what is needed.
I'm just curious about this. Like, how much does right now you're at a kidney company, right? If you were at, someplace else, you might have a completely different set of doctors and patients and caregivers that you're trying to get messaging to. How much of it is the same, sort of regardless of who the specialty or the demographics of who the patient set is, and how much of it is legitimately different around different channels and different types of communications that you're trying to put together?
So I will say the thing that doesn't change is the fact it's a medication. It's heavily regulated. It has to do with the health of patients. You cannot treat this lightly. Medicine is medicine, and you cannot start embellishing stuff out of the blue. It has to be based in science. And of course, I heavily believe in science, so I would do that even if I didn't have a regulation. But it helps to point to a regulation. That's the steady and constant part. The things that change on what is your audience. And, it may sound a little lighthearted to say audience because what we have as audience are, of course, the patients themselves. And, all of us are patients at some point in time or other. And, I'm approaching middle age. I've been a patient more frequently these years. It's a little closer to my heart than before. And you also have the doctors, and the doctors are not all alike. I mean, from the outside, perhaps, it's like the teachers. All the teachers are the same, but they're not, okay? You can have a specialist doctor who's been there and doing that particular area for years and years and knows all about it, but that particular organ or even sub organ, depending on the case. You can have generalists, you have the general practitioners who will refer. You could have somewhere in between because some diseases, depending on where they are, may not manifest as their final thing. So there were diseases that were rare diseases that were basically your organism is missing an enzyme. And because you don't have that enzyme, you go into a slow spin to end the decay, of course, which is never pretty, no matter which disease. But my point is with all of this is that, your disease could go through stages. You could have maybe neuromuscular degeneration. You could have kidney involvement. You could have, digestive things. There were some diseases of pediatric diseases that are absolutely heartbreaking that have to do with bone growths where, you fall down and your bone grows instead. But depending on what the disease presents, it involves different specialties. So some of these, like this stuff with the bone disease, it might not be caught by a general practitioner and it might not get yet to the specialist. It might be caught by somebody who gets referred to physiotherapy and the physiotherapist says, that's not a normal lump. Maybe you should check it out. So depending on the pathway of disease, you have different people who touch it. And that's where you have to figure out who needs to know what. And again, we don't even stop with the doctors. You also have nurses and physician assistants. You also have the reimbursement field and so on. So yeah, it's an involvement process. But we're all people who, you know, it matters to all of us.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think is always so fascinating about medical is you do have all of those different audiences that you need to tailor your communications to. So in that, you may have, a parent who's dealing with this tragic situation and there's so much emotions involved. The doctors, I'm sure, are attached, but they almost have to be a little bit more emotionally removed and in order to keep functioning. And then you have the payers, and it's like, okay, well, how do you quantify the value of being able to brush your teeth or walk down the stairs or something like that?
I will say some of my colleagues almost went the payer route or went the payer route and came back. So, I see that perspective too. I used to be like, it's all about the money. It's not even all about the money. From a payer's perspective is I have this group of people and I need to keep them all healthy. How do I best use my resources so that everybody gets maximal health? They're not like trying to, there were conversations a few years ago when euthanasia got approved in Canada about death panels, because you're going to try to kill your most expensive customers, whatever you want to call it. It's not about death panels. It's not about trying to deny people the cutting edge, advancement. It's about, is that proven that it does what it does? And if it proves that it does what it does, what's the maximum benefit I can do with this amount of money that I have? It's having a budget.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that kind of gets into like formulary status and the like is essentially where that comes into fruition. And so I mean, that is part of pharma is always arguing that we should be on a higher formulary than others. So it's still a competitive space. To me, it's that's where it gets tricky, right? Because there's that distinction between marketing and medical, but they sort of like if you don't get on formulary, no patients get your drugs, and then your drug fails or your launch fails.
We always have this thing of, if a tree falls in the forest, does it even make a sound? If there's nobody around to hear it. So that happens to medical if we don't publish. We could have all the data. If it's not published, nobody sees it. That happens to commercial. If nobody buys, what does it matter if the drug exists? So we all suffer from that tree falling in the forest problem.
Yes. So let's talk about that a little bit more. I've heard you use the phrase marketing is optimistic and medical deals in reality, right? So from your perspective, med affairs and psychoms, where does that tension between commercial ambition and medical responsibility show up most clearly during a launch?
Yeah, so I will say that the reason I said this is because I think marketing needs to be optimistic. They need to have a vision of what they want. And when you have a vision, by default is, you have to forge a thing that doesn't exist. So you have to be optimistic. If you start with catastrophe, you're not going anywhere. Okay. So I think that's a good thing. But what medical does and what they do best is keep things anchored in the reality and with evidence. So that's the tension, like you want to say, I'm perfect, but you can't say perfect. Medical will be always with the limitation that, and with the explanation that you can do this and only that. We only have evidence for this. You might potentially be doing a third thing, but there's no evidence yet. And we have to always, have that limit. I do think that it's great to work with commercial partners because they're very energetic and motivated. And because they're so optimistic, they're like, oh, we're gonna win, we're gonna be great. And I don't know who wants to be on a team that's not winning. I want to be on the winning team. So that enthusiasm makes me come to work happily. Okay. But sometimes you have to pull them back from the brink and say, I know you want to make this statement, but let me explain to you how I would say it, because the way you say it now, it's not backed by evidence.
It also like the optimism is good, but it also like I always think of that. I don't know. At one point, a couple of years ago, when that book Demon Copperhead came out, I got really into it, and then I reread David Copperfield. And there's this like sad sack character. I think his name's Macabre in there, he's always in debt. He's going to debtor's prison, and he has a quote where he says something like, "Annual income £20, annual expenditure £19, result is happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure 21." And the result is misery, right? And I feel like that's the same thing with a drug launch, where if you set the expectation that it's going to be a $800 million product and it's an $850 million product, everybody's happy and everything's great. And vice versa, right? If you say it's going to be a billion and you're at 900, then you're a failure, and the stock suffers and everything else. So like, how much does medical, if at all, factor into that, or how do you deal with that? Because like, there's so many things that when people are like, oh, it was a successful drug launch, it's often about did we meet expectations or not?
I think that you've put your finger on the right question. I will say that, what makes a successful launch is highly variable. In a launch, that's when you prove that your company is able to do what it says what it does. I was listening, I forget now which entrepreneur was saying the difference between tech and biotech. So in tech, you have to have a prototype from day one. In biotech, you don't see anything for 10 years and then you win. So basically, you have to launch is when you tell your investors, listen, you haven't seen anything for 10 years. Let me show you now what we can do. So, that thing of, the money pressure certainly is large, and commercial does make these projections about how many of the product they're gonna sell, and then they estimate a price. And there's always the competition. What is the competition selling at? What are they gonna do? So it's a whole model that they're building. So I've seen people where situations, launches where the drug was selling, it was available, the patients were taking, they were, compliant. So you worry about whether or not, not that the drug works. Usually the efficacy is proven in phase 2 and phase 3. But you worry about that maybe compliance is in people don't stay on the drug is ideal, or you worry about side effects that didn't happen in the clinical trials, but now with bigger populations or populations that you weren't aiming for, maybe it's off-label for some things happen or whatever. So there are things that happen in real life that you can't plan for. You do your best, but in the end, they happen. So these are things that could more or less muzzle a drug or take it off the market. FDA definitely takes it, and EMA, regulatory authorities take it for safety, number one. But you could be that it doesn't gain market share because it's not easy to administer or not easy to stay on due to various issues.
And what is Redical's role? I mean, you have a lot of times a lot of MSLs out there having these conversations. So what's your role in finding these early while there's still time to adjust strategy or refocus, the types of data that you're publishing?
So I will remind you that I'm a scientist, so I'm very biased towards the research side. But I will say for me, it's always about the data, the research. What's the basis of doing something? And the thing with research, that the reason why, biotech is different from tech and it takes 10 years to get there is because you need to research it, and you need to research it in humans, and humans have, it takes a long time for a human to do something. You could do it in flies a lot faster, you could do it in mice a lot faster, but they're not human. And in fact, that's why you do the preclinical research initially in smaller organisms or directly in the dishes. It goes fast, you answer all the questions that you can, and then you move to the human. Once you move to the human, it becomes expensive and slow. So you have to choose what kind of questions you're going to make that are absolutely necessary to establish, to not with unquestionable clarity, but to the best of your ability for that aim, okay? To establish, to get the most out of that research question with as little, the most bang for the buck, okay? And those are the phase 1, 2, and 3 study. Phase 1 is making sure that it doesn't do anything weird to healthy humans. Phase 2 is making sure it works in the patients with your disease, but you're testing typically different doses to make sure you have the ideal dose, one where you get the maximal benefit but the least amount of side effects. And then phase 3, you're doing whatever worked best in phase 2 with the most amount of people to make sure that even if it wasn't a lucky shot basically in phase 2, because if you work with small numbers, you could just get lucky. Okay. So in phase 3, you increase the numbers to say, do I see the same effect? If you do, you didn't get lucky. It's really effective. So that's the typical question. So medical wants to have that plan basically when the company is 10 people, if it's a biotech. Okay, so if it's a big pharma 5 years ahead, okay, that's very early. Nobody else is thinking about that question, okay? And so we have to think very early about what things could be happening 5 years ahead, and then line up a research plan in advance as things move forward. If something works, then what would be the next step? What other questions should we be asking and answering? So that's the medical question. What do you want to think about? You want to think about way ahead of everybody, and you want to think ahead with like a whole a contingent of research questions and answers that you could be setting up.
All right, so let's stay on that. I like what you said about you like optimism. So we'll stay at things from an optimistic point of view, right? So we're thinking of a launch and we're very, very early, and we're going to be optimistic. This is going to be a very successful drug launch, however you want to measure it. From your vantage point, from your perspective, what should medical affairs and scientific communications be doing early to set up for launch success?
So I will say that med affairs and psychoms generally should think about the data being published. That's the number one thing. It's the tree falling in the forest. If your data is not out there in the minds of the audience that you're trying to reach, it doesn't exist. It doesn't matter how many years you spend. Science is merciless sometimes. So with this med affairs and psychoms, you first think about, if I'm at launch point, what would I want to say about the drug? What kind of evidence needs to back this up? Do I have it set it up? When is it panning out? When is the actual the results of my research coming out? And then do I have enough time to publish? And publication takes, if you're reasonable and you're not trying to kill yourself, about a year for a manuscript. You can do it faster. Absolutely, you can do it faster. It consumes. For everything, there's a price. Okay. So to be honest and to not have surprises, you say it's going to be a year. And then you do your best to get there. It might be less, it might be more. You do your best. But you have to think in these increments, in yearly increments, essentially, or more.
And have you seen, because you've been involved in a number of drug launches, I'm sure not everything goes perfectly, right? So let's say Med Affairs is brought in too late, right? What I guess to make it useful, what's some indications that might be happening? And then how can you adjust if it's not a perfect scenario, you're not, doing this long-term planning from the beginning?
So in some things you can make up the time, in some others you can. So if it's a drug that has already been on the market and you're doing a new indication, you may use previous research and say, expect similar results, okay? If it's a new drug, nobody has seen it, new mechanism, new administration, the disease hasn't been researched and you come at the 11th hour, good luck. The only time you might get grace there is if there's no other competitors, nobody has worked in the field, and usually the need is so big that the patients and the FDA will work with you. But it has to be a desperate case. And I've seen those desperate cases happen, and there's a reason, that nobody else has done it. When you arrive at the 11th hour, let's say we're at the 11th hour scenario, usually have like that proverb where it says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is today. Okay, so now you're with the tree planting today, okay? What can you do? It's rarely about getting data at that point. It's about looking what is it that you have that you can publish right away, obviously, if you already have something. If not, it's working as a team with whoever's left in the company to at least support their needs. Ask them, what do you need? And see, can I at least meet that need? There are some things that they're going to say, well, I want real world evidence of 500 people on this drug. And if you haven't launched, you can't get that evidence. First you have to have the drug to test it, okay? So you're going to say, that's a very nice theoretical thing. I'll see you in 3 years, okay? But sometimes they're going to say something like, I want to know if it has digestive side effects. And then you can look in your clinical trials, which you've had to do at least one or two, and you can say, this is what we've seen. You might not be able to say in all people everywhere, but you can at least go to a subset and say, this is what we've had. Okay. So being realistic is when you're at the 11th hour, ask everybody, what do you need? And you can say, this is where I can meet you. Let's work on that. That's the low-hanging fruit. And then we can work on the more difficult stuff with time. Sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes it isn't. Again, you do the best with what you've got.
At one point in my career, I worked for a company that did a lot of advisory boards. And what I always thought was very fascinating was that some companies had some of the pharma manufacturers had really different takes on when do we engage advisors. And it always made so much sense to be the ones that did it. I guess maybe I was biased because I was like putting on these ad boards. But it's like, well, if you do it early and you're talking to them about what endpoints do you need to see while you're still designing the protocol, that to me made a lot of sense, right? Because that's kind of the type of planning that you're talking about, where you are spending all of this time and money, marching up towards hopefully a drug launch, and you want to make sure that when you do launch, are you going to be the first line treatment? Are you going to be a second line treatment? What are they more concerned about? This, that, or the other thing, safety, whatever. And having those conversations early just seems like it will help you so that you're not in that scenario where, okay, that data is great, but it doesn't actually answer my primary question.
I fully agree with you. I couldn't say this like we couldn't endorse it any harder. Okay, and it's not just prescribers, so not just your doctors or even nurses and PAs, which should be taken into account, but it's even patients. So depending on the drug and disease, you might have symptoms. It's not that the doctors don't hear about symptoms; it's that some symptoms are very generic. There are some disease areas where you can have extreme fatigue, and when you tell your doctor, "I'm tired," the reasonable people, they've seen all sorts of diseases. For them, if you're bleeding on the floor, that's clear in emergency. If you're tired, you probably can wait. We will find a solution. We'll give you coffee, or something like that. But there are diseases when you're tired, as in you go to the grocery store and you need to sit on a chair, just having entered the store because you're tired. And then you move 2 more aisles and you have to sit on a chair again. Okay, it's that tired. Okay, it's really hard to quantify that medically. Okay, so then you need the patient to have to express how that interferes with your life, and then to say, well, when you're looking for your drug, try to look for this benefit too. That matters. If your drug not only makes your disease better, but the symptoms too. I mean, a patient is like, I'm in heaven. I can now go grocery shop. Maybe that's not their dream ambition, but not to sit on a chair every 2 steps. It's something that can make a difference, okay? Alongside, I mean, I wouldn't say to replace the main efficacy. Of course, you want the drug to work on the disease, but if it has additional benefits, why not, right? So that's sort of the reason why you have to talk all early to basically your stakeholders, which are the patients, the doctors, the nurses, the physician assistants, for sure. I will say that I've seen some things. Of course, you have to talk early to regulatory authorities, and that's, I think, every company does well, because for them that's the go no go decision, what the regulatory body says. But I've seen some companies fail to have their drug approved for things like they didn't understand what is the correct endpoint. But these trials take 5 years sometimes. They can take even 10 years. It depends on which disease you are. Sometimes you're lucky and they take only 2 years, okay? but either like longer years. Things can change during that stuff. You can learn about the disease. There are new investments that say, oh, well, it's not this mechanism of action, this is other. It's not this pathway, this other pathway. It's not this molecule that you think was affecting, it's this other molecule. So everything that you thought was going through molecule one is now invalid. It could be technological changes. Just because something is done standard for a particular organ may or may not apply. And you may find out at the 11th hour. And that's really the sad part. So I would pressure test all of these assumptions as early as possible with everyone. Okay.
Wonderful. All right, Anna, let's wrap up here with one final question. So, let's say these episodes generally get published on a Thursday. If you could give one piece of advice for somebody listening who's in med affairs, in psychoms, to take in and implement on a Friday, right? Like, this is the one thing you need to do differently tomorrow. This is a very on the spot question, but they're preparing for launch. What's your advice to them?
It's a good question. I tend to think, from my perspective, is to always question assumptions and make sure that you understand everything, and then retest again right the day before, kind of stuff. But with time, so that's the scientist me. That's the me who works in isolation and just chugs along. But with time, I've noticed that it's the team that makes the whole thing. It's make sure that you know what your colleagues know, that they know what you know, that you talk to each other, and that you care about what they care. I'm sad to say that I've become a people person. It's a mind shift. When you depend on yourself, you have a measure of control, and obviously I'm a control freak. When you depend on others, you have to cede control and you have to, give up your part so that everybody can be successful. So it's a harder path. That's basically where I am. It's easy to be by yourself and say, I can do it and work alone. It's harder to work in a team because you have to chug and be motivated and interact. It's more work, in my opinion. There are extroverts who will say for them, that's how it is. I'm obviously not an extrovert.
I love that. That's a great answer. So you heard it here first, directly from Anna. She's approved you to take your team out, send the expenses her way, and have a nice Friday lunch. Get to know what motivates each other. I think that's a fantastic answer. And let's leave it there. Anna, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was a wonderful conversation.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of Pharma Sessions with me, Jonathan Kaskey. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to hit follow or subscribe and share it with someone else in the pharma world who might need to hear it. For more on pharma trends, career growth, and business strategies, connect with me, Jonathan Kaskey, on LinkedIn. Until next time, thanks for listening.